Welcome back to USA Daily Report. I'm your host. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a question that may sound at first very far from Taiwan, but in reality, it is so close that it is impossible to ignore. What happens when an authoritarian regime enters its final stage? And the bitterly ironic answer today is not in Beijing, but unfolding in Iran. Iran today is not only a Middle East story, it is not just protests, crackdowns, or passing headlines. Iran is becoming a vivid mirror, showing how a highly centralized power system functions when it begins to fracture from within. And if you look closely enough, with enough clarity, you will recognize a troubling familiarity in that image, at least for the system operating in Zhongnanhai. And for Taiwan, this is not a story to watch out of curiosity. It is even less someone else's problem, because within what is happening in Tehran, there are glimpses of a scenario that China and the entire East Asian region cannot fully stand apart from. Today, we will move from Iran to China, and then return to Taiwan to answer an even bigger question. What truly causes a regime to collapse? And why is that lesson so important that Taiwan cannot sleep peacefully? Dear listeners, as we have said, Iran today is not only the Middle East story. For many observers, it is also a clear warning, one that is deeply worth reflecting on for Taiwan and for societies facing pressure from totalitarian models. Because Iran's current situation may well be the image of China tomorrow gradually coming into view, as the circumstances of these two countries are similar at many key points. Iran is not an atheist state built on materialist ideology. However, the ruling class in Tehran, over many decades, has actively studied, absorbed, and applied techniques of governance inherited from the former Soviet Union and from today's China. Put simply, Iran and China are using the same textbook for authoritarian power management, one in which regime stability is always placed above the people's freedom. Two systems alike, in essence, differing mainly in the borders of the nation state. If we look deeply at how the apparatus is organized and controlled, we can see that Iran's clerical system and revolutionary institutions very clearly reflect the Zhongnanhai-style state model. Ideological screening, building networks of loyal personnel, and maintaining parallel security forces to monitor one another. All of this creates a dense power structure, difficult to challenge from within. Most notable is the role of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. In practice, this force operates in a way very similar to China's People's Liberation Army, the PLA, an army that is not merely tasked with national defense, but first and foremost serves as an instrument to protect ideology and the survival of the ruling system. Political loyalty is placed above all professional military standards, and that is the core point of convergence between these two models that may appear so different. In terms of information control, Iran's approach is not new, but the intensity is enough to draw global attention. Tehran has repeatedly cut off the internet nationwide, built a closed domestic intranet, applied deep packet inspection, and deployed large-scale surveillance systems. These capabilities are either provided directly or modeled on Chinese technology, including systems supplied by Huawei. In other words, these are not improvised measures, they are the products of a standardized control model. Turning to propaganda, the similarities become even clearer. Iran's propaganda apparatus is almost a direct copy of Zhongnanhai's. The narrative structure repeats familiar messages so relentlessly that if you change the geographic setting, many listeners would struggle to tell the difference. Claims of foreign forces pulling strings. The mantra that stability comes first. The insistence that chaos is only temporary, but victory is inevitable. When the system malfunctions, responsibility is always pushed onto private capital, reactionary elements, or outside enemies, and so on. Meanwhile, the state model itself is absolutely correct and never, under any circumstances, at fault. Iran's domestic propaganda and external messaging follow the same template Beijing has used for years. If you place side by side a recent speech on the 16th by Ali Khamenei and imagine that same content being read in Zhongnanhai, you will quickly notice something interesting. It is exactly how China's leader Xi Jinping would speak. The word choices, the assignment of blame, the calls for unity against external threats, there is virtually no difference. If anything, the only difference is the backdrop and the flag behind the podium. That is why what is happening in Iran is not merely pressure on a theocratic rule. Even Zhongnanhai, in its own distinct way, carries the silhouette of a secular theocracy. In reality, this is the moment when the Chinese-style authoritarian governance model is being placed under real-world pressure, not on paper, not in academic reports, but in the lived reality of society. If the current system collapses in Iran, it will not only be the failure of the Tehran regime, it will be the failure of an entire set of authoritarian governance techniques that China has exported, tested, and refined for many years. More importantly, that scenario would prove something with enormous philosophical weight. Ordinary people can resist and even overcome the most advanced technologies of repression. And once that awareness forms, it carries immense influence over the Chinese public. Because sometimes the most frightening thing for a control model is not power itself, but the loss of belief that this power is invincible. Another important lesson from Iran can be summarized in a short but deeply striking sentence. Authoritarian regimes do not collapse only because of street protests. They collapse when their own power system begins to disintegrate from within. Protests ultimately are only the visible surface. History shows that what truly terrifies a regime is not the crowd on the streets, but the wavering of people inside the apparatus. When the gears of the system no longer mesh, the power machine, no matter how massive, begins to make ominous sounds. According to information published by the Wall Street Journal in the United States, some Iranian officials at middle or lower levels in interviews about completely unrelated topics voluntarily expressed a desire to return to the Pahlavi monarchy. In another case, an Iranian serviceman with his face covered publicly declared support for the Crown Prince living in exile. These are not slogans shouted in a public square. They are signals coming from deep inside the system. And the crucial point is this: they are not protesters. They are people inside the apparatus, and the real danger only emerges when the system begins to crack on its own, when loyalty is no longer assumed but becomes a question to be weighed. And notably, a similar scenario is not limited to Iran. It has been and is quietly taking shape in China. Familiar signs are beginning to surface. Orders come down from above, but are carried out half-heartedly. Security forces hesitate, delay. Local officials choose to stand and watch, waiting to see which way the wind will blow. Mid-level managers freeze, afraid to decide, afraid to be wrong, and no one wants to be the last person standing to defend a ship that everyone can already sense may be close to capsizing. That is the institutional crisis China is facing, and it is precisely the stage the regime fears most. So much so that Xi has repeatedly issued public warnings, calling it a state of institutional paralysis when the apparatus no longer runs smoothly. Power on paper may still exist, but its real effectiveness begins to evaporate. And it must be emphasized again, it is not public street protests that are the most frightening scenario for an authoritarian regime. The most frightening thing is a sudden break that happens inside the system itself. Iran has now entered that phase quite clearly. Beijing, meanwhile, is doing everything it can to prevent a similar scenario from happening to it. Moving money and gold, preparing escape routes, sending family members abroad to live. In every revolution, mass protests often serve only as a catalyst. But when the inner structure begins to panic, the foundation of the regime truly starts to shake. And when people at the highest levels quietly send their families overseas, apply for visas, move cash and gold out, and prepare an exit route, then in reality, that system has already entered a countdown phase. Even if outwardly they still try to project stability, these signs are now appearing more and more clearly in both Iran and China. And that is exactly why the lesson from Iran is not only for the Middle East. It is a universal warning for any power model built on absolute control. French media recently reported that Iran's parliamentary speaker, Mohammed Barib, had tried to apply for a visa through a lawyer in Paris. At the same time, a nephew of a former Iranian president was also reportedly submitting a visa application. There is even information suggesting that senior Iranian officials contacted the French authorities through intermediaries in Oman to arrange visas for relatives. Taken separately, these details might be dismissed. But together, they form a picture that is difficult to ignore. Lebanese media also reported that Iran's foreign minister brought his entire family, his wife, daughter, and 2 sons, to Lebanon as part of an official work trip. What is notable is that after this information leaked, he abruptly canceled scheduled meetings and left earlier than planned. That kind of action needs no long explanation. It speaks for itself. Alongside that, there have also been unconfirmed reports claiming that Iran's president submitted a resignation, though the information was quickly denied. In authoritarian regimes, such rumors rarely appear without reason. They often reflect a widening anxiety among the ruling elite, where people begin to think about retreat options before upheaval arrives. For Beijing, this pattern is not unfamiliar. Chinese officials have behaved similarly for decades. Moving assets abroad, sending children overseas to study, arranging for spouses to settle in another country, and so on. This is not random. It is political insurance for an uncertain future. And it was precisely this trend that Xi tried to reverse after taking power. The anti-corruption campaign was launched on a massive scale, but in reality, it was not only about cleaning up the system, it was also meant to stop officials from quietly preparing escape routes. Because China's leadership understands a brutal truth. A regime does not fall when the people take to the streets. It falls when its own insiders no longer believe the system will protect them to the end. Iran at this moment shows that very instant unfolding in real time, not through grand declarations, but through concrete actions by those at the highest ranks, seeking visas, moving families, preparing exits. And for that reason, Iran, as a living reference point, is sketching a volatile transition scenario that Zhongnanhai could be forced to confront in a similar period of chaos. After 47 years under an authoritarian regime, Iran is a textbook example of a society drained from within. The opposition has been crushed, political leaders eliminated or forced to disappear, and institutions hollowed out, existing in name only. Legitimacy may remain ready for takeover, the state structure may dissolve, yet the nation endures. But history often moves in unpredictable ways. Few expected that in what seemed like a deadlock situation, there would be a sudden reemergence of a crown prince living in exile. Iran's remaining reservoir of traditional political capital, in the end, still lies in the Pahlavi monarchy and its symbolic heir. When modern structures are suffocated, history paradoxically becomes the final resource. Place Iran next to China, and the similarities become clearer. If Iran still has the Pahlavi crown prince in exile, then the comparable historical resource for China is the Republic of China, which continues to exist and persist in Taiwan. One side is a monarchy that was overthrown but not erased from historical memory. The other is a state that once ruled all of China and then retreated to the island in the east. As long as legitimacy and historical succession have not been completely erased, future transitions may still be able to unfold with far less bloodshed. The history of the Republic of China demonstrates this in a tragic yet unmistakable way, from the Xinhai Revolution in 1911 that ended the Qing dynasty, through the capital shifts between Nanjing and Chongqing, and finally to Taipei in 1949. Across 113 years of existence, the history of the Republic of China has been intertwined with war, division, and exile. And so, an unavoidable question emerges: will history allow the Republic of China for a third time to return to Nanjing when it has already made Nanjing its capital twice before? That question is not only geographic. It is a question of historical continuity and the capacity of a ruptured politics to transform. And it is precisely here that Iran's potential transition becomes especially meaningful. If Iran can use the Pahlavi monarchy as an anchor in a transitional phase, then it cannot be ruled out that one day China might also look back to the Republic of China as a similar historical point of support. This is the most illuminating dimension of Iran's upheaval, especially when viewed from the perspective of Chinese society. One powerful symbolic detail closes this picture. Iranians burn the tomb of Ruhollah Khomeini, the figure regarded as the founding father of the Islamic Republic. If placed in the Chinese context, Could a similar act occur in Tiananmen? And the question is, would that be a warning to Beijing? Looking back across the strait, what configuration could reshape the future? In Taiwan today, under constant military pressure from China, local identity is rising strongly, and resistance to unification is steadily increasing. Many Taiwanese have completely rejected the idea of China viewing what happens on the mainland as irrelevant to them. That view is understandable, but if placed within the long flow of history and the cycles of collapse and restructuring of authoritarian regimes, perhaps there still needs to be a moment to pause and think more deeply. Because sometimes history does not disappear. It only steps back temporarily, waiting to be called by name again. A Zhongnanhai that is clearly expansionist makes Taipei unsafe, but a China that becomes poor, chaotic, and collapses into instability does not bring safety to this island either. That is the geopolitical paradox Taiwan must confront, whether it wants to or not. Try to imagine this. If China collapses into chaos, the consequences will not stop on the mainland. Refugees will surge outward, boat after boat, forming a massive humanitarian migration wave. That scenario alone would place serious pressure on Taiwan economically, socially, and in security terms. In that context, any simplistic calculation, if the other side collapses, we become safer, becomes unrealistic. That is why Taiwan needs to view the problem in a broader strategic picture, rather than focusing only on the immediate military threat. And that is exactly why what is happening in Iran has become uniquely important. Not only because Iran resembles China, but because Iran shows what happens when an authoritarian model enters its final stage. The next question is sensitive, but it cannot be avoided. What if, at that moment, Xi Jinping himself wants to run? When a regime collapses, the fate of the leader is always the biggest unknown. In a scenario where Zhongnanhai disintegrates, Xi Jinping's options would be extremely limited. The possibility that he could flee to Russia, France, or any Western country is almost impossible. This is a figure who demands absolute control and clearly not the type who would accept living under someone else's rules. Would he accept living under Vladimir Putin's roof? That is unlikely. Exile, by nature, is a condition of dependence, and it does not fit the personality or the power style Xi has displayed over many years. More plausible, if he had to choose a retreat path, would be a poor country in Africa or a small island in the Pacific, where money and influence networks could buy near total control. There have been reports suggesting that the Xi family has quietly built influence in certain African countries and in a specific Pacific island nation. The name of that country was not disclosed, but the signs of early preparation are difficult to deny. And from here, the final question, the most important one, emerges. When that decisive moment arrives, will the Chinese people allow it to happen? Or, in other words, at a historic moment, who will truly control the escape route of power? Dear listeners, Iran's story today is not only the story of a distant Middle Eastern country, it is a very real, very vivid cross-section of how an authoritarian system operates, fractures, and exposes its own fatal weaknesses. From information control, propaganda, and repression to the moment elites begin planning their escape, it all reflects a familiar historical pattern. Power does not collapse while it remains confident. It collapses when those in power no longer believe in the system's future. For China, Iran is like a mirror placed directly in front, not to decide who is right or wrong, but to see clearly what happens when absolute control collides with realities that cannot be controlled. And for Taiwan, the lesson is even larger. A belligerent China that constantly threatens expansion and annexation is already a danger, but a China collapsing into chaos is an even darker scenario that Taipei must consider. History rarely offers simple choices. The most important point Iran's story raises is not found in protests, not in the level of repression, but in a profoundly human question. When the system can no longer protect those who serve it, how long can that system survive? And when the faith of the elite disappears, all slogans of stability, strength, eternal glory, and so on ultimately become nothing but empty shouting. History has a habit of returning, but it never repeats in exactly the same way. It only reminds humanity that power can be built by fear, but it cannot be sustained by fear. At some point, fear reverses direction. And here, we would like to thank you for staying with us until the final minute of the program. Because if you are still here at this hour, then clearly history, geopolitics, and military stories are not only about other people and other countries. I look forward to continuing these discussions with you in future analyses where what is happening today may be the mirror and lesson that reflects tomorrow. Wishing you a truly pleasant evening. Goodbye, and see you next time.